for me, the parallel between the blurring of line in the Impressionist painters and the blurring of tonality is the actual connection between Impressionism. Now, as we know, Debussy historically had mixed feelings about that. He first denied that his pieces should be called Impressionism, but 10 years later he wrote in a letter to the publisher using the term himself in reference to his own work. So apparently he adopted it. And although we think of the idea of images of painting, to me it's the technique that links the two, whereas reality was being blurred by light by the Impressionists, and tonality is blurred by the kinds of techniques that Debussy was using. Blurred but never destroyed completely and never abandoned completely.
If you think of Monet haystack, it's the same haystack in the same position on the canvas, but the light is what is changing and the color is what is changing. And we see Debussy transposing that concept in so many of his pieces.
The other thing, I think he was interested in light. I think Reflet dans l'eau is fascinating. It's a bit like Monet, who, when he painted a water lily lake, okay, he's painting, but what is he painting? He's painting the water lilies, or is he painting the reflection of the light? And you look at that, then a minute later you look through and you see the bed underneath, and then you look and you see the sky, you see the flashes of light.
You mentioned the special quality of light. The thing about him, I think, is that he's thoroughly visual. It's light he's catching, but it's shapes and colours and gestures. He's got such a sense of space. Impressionism, in the best sense, it's the impression of what the eye sees before the brain has processed it, put it into boring drawers and said, you know, that's just the front of Rouen Cathedral, it's rough grey stone, file it away. It looks a bit different in sunlight, file it away in another box. It can look green, it can look blue, it can look pink. Monet has just painted exactly what the eye picks up before the brain tries to file it away and make it harmless. You can see Debussy doing that with sound as well.
He says in his letters that he stored many memories, and especially vis-a-vis the sea. There's a famous letter where he writes to Durand that you might be surprised that I conceived La Mer in the Burgundian hillsides, nowhere near the edge of the sea, but I have stored from my childhood many memories.
I suppose the question is, how does a composer sound impressionistic? There's a wonderful painting by Georges Seurat, great pointillist, called Sunday at La Grande Jatte. Picture of people on the shore of the lake having a good time, and from a distance that's exactly what you see. But if you creep up closer and closer to the painting, you see mostly a series of dots, and it's extraordinary how your eye can combine all of these dots into an impression of people at the park. I guess that's where impressionistic comes from. And in La Mer, Debussy does very much the same thing. From a distance, if you're sitting in the audience, you get the impression of something going on. But if you look at the score and see how he actually scores these sounds, you'll be amazed to see how much detail is in the blurring. For example, here on this first page of the score, the work starts rather ambiguously. There's just a timpani roll on the B, and the basses are doubling it. Then the harps come in. There are two harps, and they play the same two notes, but a beat apart. So it sounds like this. So already there's a little bit of blurring. To make it even more of a blur, he has the cellos come in playing the same two notes, but an entirely different rhythm. They play so when you add it together, again, same notes, but lots of blurring. Then to make things even more ambiguous, there's a viola melody that creeps in here, and the viola is almost unnoticed at the beginning. And if you'd like to play that, I will try to accomplish the cello and the harp lines underneath. So the beginning goes like this. Now, what's very unusual about that is that the violas are playing basically 2 beats per note, while everyone else has been playing 3 plus 3, the violas are playing 2 plus 2 plus 2. Mm-hmm. So 6 beats in each bar, but again, some blurring of the rhythm. So the whole opening, this is just the first 5 bars of La Mer, is filled with all these incredible details, rhythmic ambiguities, a blur, a wash of sound, giving the impression maybe of very, very simple laps of water overlapping at the shore or something like that. It certainly gives a calm impression.
Everything about the artistic scene in Paris, because that was where it was happening. What later became hallmarks of the 20th century in terms of literature. The whole soup was so thick at that point. Everything that was new and was trying to reevaluate what the 19th century had been in terms of techniques and in terms of aesthetics, all of that was happening around him.
terrific artistic ferment at that time. And to be there at the time of one of these exhibitions, the only way you can get the atmosphere of it is to see there's some beautiful picture books produced. You just leaf through these and see the pictures of what was going on. You think to have been living in Paris then. There are moving walkways invented for the first time, and the metro is just about to open. And also the scientific discoveries and psychology, they felt that they were at the point of uniting art, science and religion and mysticism. Everything was going to answer everything else. And then along came the First World War and changed it all again.
Sitting in the coffee house in Paris and observing the people and the art of conversation, it was a whole different aura. There's a kind of elegance and a quiet maturity that is lacking today. And yes, I'm sure the influence of Paris as one of the greatest cities in the world, in the gardens and to go in the squares and walking around every street is like another mystery. You're really walking in a museum. And everything is another surprise, another revelation. The light and moods and the clouds and the sun or the lack thereof.
When it rains in Paris, it has such a special blue-gray quality. And I can recall many times being in some little garret in a little room in a tiny hotel in Paris when it's raining and I'm right next to the tile roof. That is the most special quality for me in terms of weather in Paris.
There is another side of light, remember, which is actually the lights of the music hall and the entertainment business, because Whistler wrote this famous essay called Le 10 o'clock, which is about the way that art is now beginning to explore. Art begins when the entertainment light comes on. There's people like Toulouse-Lautrec and Manet painting of the server at the Folies Bergère. There's two versions of that. And it has a mirror with the light, so you see that it is that culture is dependent on electric light. And things like minstrels, not so much General Lavigne, but that side of music, well, even the cakewalk stuff, that entertainment world which perhaps he shared with Satie. I think of Debussy in one of those Parisian rooms with his cigarette and then going out to a cafe and talking to all those other people. That's the Parisian bit for me.
Many many of the pieces suggest light. Brouillard, the fog, that suggests light or absence of light.
I think the fog in Debussy's day
Yes.
would have been very different and an awful lot thicker. But where they really liked to come and see the fog was London. There's a Verlaine poem, what's that called, about fog, when he came to London. And they loved walking through this black where people passed in the mist, you know, they romanticised it really. And Brouillard, you know, that is his mistiest piece.
When I talk about symbolism in Debussy, I'm not just talking about, well, there's a motive here that has that meaning and a motive that has that meaning, but these ideas run across boundaries. They have meaning beyond the works themselves. The point is that there is an awareness at that time of these inner states. That's what the symbolists are all about. That's what Freud is all about. That's what Chekhov and Ibsen, by the way, Ibsen's late plays are and Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk work are the source for the French symbolism.
The essence of symbolist literature is that everything stands for something else. And in Louis' words, in Louis' poems, and in particular the Billy T story, I would say, every single word and sound that he uses is something that's used to evoke something beyond itself. You never actually learn in the poem what transpired between Billy T and the young man she's with, but Debussy makes very clear through his music that whatever happened between them was positively magical.
There's all a new way looking into the inner self and into even the pathological clinical conditions of their characters, which is not the case with romantic literature or realist literature. There is really a big trend toward a new interest in psychological motivation as well as metaphor, ambiguity, and symbol. And that psychological motivation becomes very important at the turn of the century in all of these writers, Strindberg, Dostoevsky, and the symbolist poets.
One was the whole sort of symbolist movement. The whole of Paris was obsessed with the Orient. Travel had improved, Japan had opened up to the rest of the world. They were suddenly able to be aware of Far Asia in a way that the West had never been before. All that art was flooding into Europe in a way it hadn't before. So he was surrounded by people who were interested in it. They had the 1889 exhibition. There were paintings, there were musicians, actors coming from that part of the world. So Paris in 1889 and 1900 again was the whole world. You could wander from one country into another country. All over, you could do the globe basically in quarter of a mile practically. And it still amazes me to see these old photos of that whole part of Paris along the Seine, from the Champ de Mars right up to the Invalides practically, turned into a miniature of the whole world. And they looked like big palaces, and they were made of sort of thin materials and all dismantled after it was over, and suddenly Paris just turned back into being sooty old Paris, as it were.
There's one element of Debussy's music that has achieved a great deal of attention, and that's the element of the Arabesque. Let me try and connect that with light. The pair of pieces that everyone knows quite well are the two Arabesques, somewhat early piano works. Arabesque, not only in melody, but likewise in structural level, means an unpredicted and often intertwining sense of line. And I believe that light is a corollary with this Arabesque play of line. The play of light, of course, is not to be predicted. It constantly shifts, how it bounces off the water in reflections in the water. All of these kinds of things are elements of the Arabesque in nature, but one that Debussy must have seized on. I think he most assuredly was very conscious of nature. One work besides the Arabesques for piano that has always interested me a very great deal is the piano prelude from Book 1, Des Pas sur la Neige, Footsteps in the Snow. And if you look at that from the standpoint of the Arabesque, of light as an image in footsteps, you can see the unpredicted movement of light as these footsteps seem to get traced through the snow. The atmosphere, the light, is of course quite subdued. It is that gray-white light that we know about when we walk through the snow that he captures so brilliantly. He does so, he makes his environment, he makes his colors, he makes his sense of place by way of the tonality and texture. In Footsteps in the Snow, you certainly have a wonderful sparseness, a kind of dispersion of the texture, which you might associate with dispersion of the light in a perhaps darkened place with a lot of snow.
If you go to Monet's house in Giverny, the walls, it's a big house, and the walls of every room are festooned with Japanese prints. I've heard very interesting lectures by people like David Bromfield, who's written about it, showing actually how the techniques of these prints, the way you cut the subject in a picture, the way you place it, the whole composition and the use of colours, he's compared Monet's paintings to Japanese prints. And when I heard him doing that, I kept thinking, Debussy's doing exactly that in music. He's composing, he's cutting subjects, he's placing them in his canvas, in the proportions of his painting in exactly the same way, and setting things in relief the same way. I heard a lecture on Monet and Japanese art, and I just kept thinking every time he said Monet, he could have said Debussy. Well, I think that's the sort of key work, because he had been fascinated by hearing the gamelan in 1889, and I think he just sat and let that mull around in his mind. He kept writing music, and occasionally you can hear little echoes of it, sometimes in his pentatonic, but not always, because pentatonic comes from all around the world. But then he heard it again in 1900, and I think then was when he was asking himself big questions about how to write for the piano without sounding like what had gone before. And in Pagodas, where he's got the perfect excuse to enter into his Asian persona. Debussy almost turned himself into an Oriental man in some ways. He was obsessed and fascinated with that part of the world. And although Orientalism was a great fashionable thing in the late 19th century, I think what he did was very different. Rather than just borrowing it a little bit to colour his music, he went the other way. He went right to it and went into it and tried to become part of it. The way he thinks altogether, there's somebody who's stepped a little bit outside the Western world, and that's why he was always a bit of a square peg in a round hole socially. He's somebody who sees it just from a step back and thinks this world's a slightly crazy place. He's looking at it, I think, as an Asian person would look at the West. He's also looking at Asia as a Westerner, and he has this marvellous sort of double take, and being the intelligent man he was, he's well aware of it and exploits it. There's nowhere else in his music where he enters, I think, so completely into that Asian persona, except in parts of La Mer, which are exactly contemporary, and they have a lot in common with Pagodas. And it's typical of him that having done something once, he's not going to repeat it again, but it leaves its traces everywhere. And And if you do play his piano duet version of La Mer, you suddenly realize how close to Pagoda's the opening of La Mer is. He was sketching it at the same time. They're sort of twin pieces in a way.
Looking at the way Debussy scores this particular passage, this is the calm after the storm in the third movement. It shows such a wealth of imagination in the detail, yet the overall impression is of a very simple melody and an accompaniment. But how he gets to just that simple melody and accompaniment, I think, is one of the keys to not only the piece, but the genius behind the piece, and what actually makes this impressionistic. For example, there are two harps involved here. They're basically just playing a series of alternating thirds back and forth. This is the second harp register. The first harp will enter every other beat with an octave higher. So together you hear one register, then another register, just shades of light coming in and out. In the first violins, they're playing a harmonic A flat way up here. Below, the cellos are tremoloing D flat, A flat. So they're playing the fifth. The bass just sustains the D flat. And when you put it all together, of course, again, I can't quite demonstrate it, but just outlining a D flat major chord, no problem. Then comes a rather extraordinary moment. We have this very beautiful melody played by not just the flute alone, and not just the oboe alone, but the flute and the oboe together. If this were a lesser composer, you'd probably have only one of those instruments playing. But Debussy is the master of color and of sound, and he knows if you put the flute and the oboe together on the same notes in this register very quietly, you get a flobo, I guess, or you get a sound of an amalgamated instrument that doesn't exist really, but it makes an amazing color. And Tony, if you'd like to play this melody, it has a sense of, underneath this D flat, has a sense of longing. There's little half-step longings, and then whole step longings, right. These appoggiaturas really play with your emotions. More details that are quite amazing. Even though they're playing the same note in the same register, the flute plays 1, 3, 1, 3. The oboe plays 1, 2, 3. So you put it together, it's not quite the same. As the line goes, the melody starts to descend, if you want to demonstrate there. And while you're descending, the second violins and the clarinet are ascending chromatically. Together it sounds like. And they almost descend upon one another. Again, yet another sense of blurring. There are a couple of other touches here in this melody that you just played very beautifully. The second violins come in with a tremolo playing the same notes. but in a different rhythm. Again, yet another layer. There are 3 layers of blurring in this melody. And the bar later, the French horn in the middle of this longing. The B flat is sustained. Another resonance within the orchestra, but putting it all together, it's an extraordinary picture.
In my opinion, I think he's the first modernist. And with his great originality and creativity, which he revealed ever since he was a student and did things his teachers didn't like, he came up with a new musical language.
It was Debussy who was the father of contemporary music, not Schoenberg, because of that very thing, because Debussy was able to take the materials of music and free them, whereas Schoenberg had to destroy them.
That's why a lot of composers look toward Debussy, who were not French. Manuel de Falla, Albéniz, Vaughan Williams, Szymanowski, Bartók, Kodály, Stravinsky, Griffiths. You can go on all day naming the composers who espoused Impressionism, literally because of the influence of Debussy, because he represented a viable alternative to the Wagnerian fervor that was so strong in Paris in the late 19th century.
I think Debussy is the one who opened the windows of the house of music. And for example, Wagner is for me someone who closed it, is more connected to the dying process of music.
Debussy, I think in La Mer especially, not only harmonically advances the sound of classical music, but the way he treats the orchestra individually and in very unusual combinations is what makes this such a unique piece, a unique sound. And it's no wonder that there were many other composers after him, including George Gershwin, by the way, who sought to combine orchestral colors in this very unique way, in a very impressionistic way, from this point forward.
Debussy is that he is going deeper into the melody. The melody will become more and more free in future between the harmonics and the rhythm. I think he's making free the rhythm from the melody. Yeah, Debussy is a modern composer, and when we hear Debussy we feel connected with the modern world. The sound is changing, the instrument will change, the world will change in his sound.